Monsieur le Président, je peux vous demander quand même de penser...
Mr. President, might I ask you to spare a thought for the terrorist attack in Brussels last night where 2 Swedish citizens were murdered? I'd be grateful if we could mark that with a minute's silence this morning. Thank you.
Ich weiß, dass die Präsidentin...
I know when the President will have the floor, we'll have a minute of silence. Thank you very much for your comment. Obviously, our condolences are with the victims of the attack. Presidency of the Council, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Señorías.
Thank you, President. Honourable members, Commissioner. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is a clear violation of the UN Charter and the fundamental principles of international law. Thanks to our unity, we've managed to provide political, economic and military support to Ukraine and adopt an unprecedented range of sanctions against the Russian regime. The current sanctions regime against Russia is the widest and most decisive ever decided upon by the European Union. As expressed by our leaders at the Versailles summit last year, the European Union is prepared to step up pressure on Russia and Belarus, including the adoption of further restrictive measures. Our sanctions have been designed to reduce Russia's capacity to carry out its illegal war against Ukraine, reduce its state's budget and prevent access to key technologies which are relevant to defence. The effectiveness of this system has been shown by the decline of the defence and manufacturing industries in Russia and its loss of competitiveness over the medium and longer term. But we need to enforce new sanctions to step up the effectiveness of our regime. The recent measures adopted in the 11th sanctions package have this goal in mind. This is important for all the assets sanctioned, but also for combat technologies that Russia would be able to purchase to pursue its war against Ukraine. Given the significance of the measures, it's important that they be uniformly enforced. That means we have to start by preaching by example. The European Union must redouble its efforts for cooperation, thanks to cooperation amongst the Member States and the Commission. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now for the Commission, Mr. Reinders.
Thank you, President. Dear State Secretary, dear members of the Parliament, today we face a grim milestone. It is 600 days since Russia's war of aggression began against Ukraine. Since day one, we have been clear where we stand. We stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. And we stand united as a European Union. Together, we have adopted 11 packages of sanctions so far. Together, we have acted to end our energy reliance on Russia within a very short space of time. And together, we have successfully diversified our supplies of energy and raw materials. Let me now briefly outline the impact of our measures on Russia. First of all, I want to reassure you, sanctions are having a strong impact on the Russian economy. Note that Russia carefully cherry-picks the economic data that it publishes. Sanctions have curbed the revenues that Russia can use to finance the war. For instance, budget figures reveal that Russia's income from oil and gas has significantly declined, while there are large increases in military spending. This has resulted in an estimated budget deficit of 1.7 trillion rubles, in fact 15.9 billion euros, for this year. We can see that the oil price cap and sanctions more generally are depriving Russia of its usual income sources to finance the war. In addition, immobilizing the assets of the Central Bank of Russia of about 300 billion euro, of which 2/3 we know are in the European Union, was effective. It immediately created strong pressure on the ruble and forced the Russian authorities to turn to drastic capital control measures. And it is important to recognize that Russia is implementing a number of measures to support its economy and counter the effects of sanctions. While these Russian countermeasures may provide some stabilization, they also tie up resources that would otherwise be available to finance the war. The Russian countermeasures also include the illegal expropriation of foreign assets and forced administration of foreign companies, which undermine prospects for a return to normality. Russia is going now through a so-called reconstruction process, allegedly rebuilding its economy and reorienting its trade flows. But the outcome of this process is a less efficient economy facing higher costs. First and foremost, Russia's war and the strong response from the European Union and our allies compromise the growth potential of the Russian economy. Inflationary expectations are increasing again. Russia's central bank is pursuing a more restrictive policy, and their fiscal space is not large enough to extend sufficient support to all sectors. Russia's long-term growth is undermined by our sanctions regime too. And let us not forget the kind of growth Russia is experiencing at the moment. Russia is turning its economy into a war economy. But manufacturing weapons and ammunition will not improve the well-being of Russian citizens. There is no room for complacency. Sanctions need to be implemented in full. We are working closely with the Member States, like-minded partners and third countries to tackle gaps and to address Russia's attempts to circumvent all restrictive measures. In fact, we are doing the same with Russia as a country. That's what we try to do with the oligarchs and entities on the list of sanctions, where we are trying to freeze the assets of those oligarchs and entities. And you know that we are in discussion with you and with the Council about a proposal of directive to harmonize the different sanctions and the definition of sanctions when there is an attempt to circumvent the sanction regime, and certainly when there is an attempt to circumvent such a possibility to freeze assets, we want to go to a step further in justice with a possible confiscation of such a kind of assets. So we are working on that, and we have had again a meeting of the task force with all the member states yesterday in Brussels about that. And I said so we are working very closely with the member states, and Russia is building new physical and financial infrastructures and restructuring trade patterns, logistics and supply chains to circumvent our sanctions. These circumvention efforts show that sanctions are working as intended and cutting off access to many goods. Of course, sanctions cannot win the war alone, and there will always be profiteers looking to make a quick buck. However, they can, including by evading sanctions. These sanctions damage our collective efforts. And all these actions, damage our collective efforts. All the actions to try to circumvent the sanctions, to take profits in the framework of the sanctions. And we need to work closely, again, with our partners to prevent circumvention. We need all member states to play their part, and the Commission will continue to support them. For example, our sanctions now allow us to list people who facilitate the evasion of sanctions. The Commission is continually revising its guidance and facts. And the Commission regularly convenes meetings with Member States to discuss implementation and to exchange best practices. We also need to act with our international partners. This is why we have appointed an EU International Special Envoy for sanctions implementation. The envoy's work has focused on stopping Russia's attempts to procure key technologies for the battlefield, prohibited by our sanctions, that make their way to Russia via third countries. We are also in regular contact with third countries to learn together how to best limit sanctions circumvention. Honourable members, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today, because it's not enough to put into place 11 packages of sanctions. The most important part is to be sure that it's possible to enforce those sanctions and, again, to fight against all forms of circumventions. And I count on your support to continue to work on this, sometimes also with some legislative proposals. Of course, I know that you are sharing the Commission's commitment towards Ukraine, and I thank you for it. So we'll continue to work together, and I will be very pleased to hear your views today. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both speakers for their introductory remarks. Now, the floor goes to Andrius Kubilius.
Dear colleagues, the fact is that Russia still is able to continue and to finance its war against Ukraine. Russia recently announced that in 2024 its defense budget will be increased by nearly 70% and will reach 107 billion euros. From the very beginning of the war, we introduced sanctions on Russian oil and gas exports as a major source of Russian financial income. First of all, of course, we need to see that those sanctions are working. Russia gets 2 times less income from export of gas and oil than they were receiving before the war. The most painful sanctions were established last December with the introduction of oil price cap, since the oil is bringing the biggest amount of income. Despite the fact that the price cap sanctions hit Russian incomes very heavily, still Russia is able to get around of 700 million euros a day from its fossil fuel exports, and the EU is still sending to Russia around of 2 billion euros per month for the import of oil and gas. It's time for us to look how we can increase effectiveness of our sanctions policy, especially on gas and oil. I would like just to name next steps what we need to do. First, to further lower the cap on crude oil price from the current $60 per barrel to $30 per barrel. Second, to impose an embargo on Russian LNG imports. Third, to introduce restriction on fuel imports if fuels are produced by said countries using Russian oil. Fourth, to introduce price cap on Russian ammonium fertilizer exports. Fifth, to prohibit transshipment of Russian oil and LNG through EU territorial waters and exclusive economic zones. Sixth, to introduce restrictions on European tanker services, on sale of tankers, as well as on European insurance services for tankers, if these are used to export Russian oil. And seventh, to introduce an enforced and centralized EU-level oversight of sanctions implementation. In addition, let's introduce sanctions on companies which are building Russian Arctic 2 LNG terminal. Let's introduce sanctions on export of Russian aluminium and on Rosatom and export of nuclear fuel. It depends on us if Russia will continue to be able to finance its war.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Cimochevich.
Dear President, dear Commissioner, the sanctions were intended to lower Russia's capacity to continue the war of aggression. Have we succeeded? To a limited extent, unfortunately. The budget revenue is smaller, it's harder to produce ammunition and military equipment, but the war is continuing. In some cases, paradoxically, the sanctions were counterproductive. Freezing the assets of some oligarch meant that 50 billion euro came back to Russia. We all know what is happening. Russia is reorganizing its economy. Some countries do not recognize our sanctions. India and China have leapt up on this occasion in order to earn more money. Technological sanctions are also bypassed via European companies. Many of our companies do business as usual. Yes, the imports of gas and oil to Europe have been curtailed, but they continue. Does this all mean that the sanctions should be abolished? Of course not. They should be continued. We need to be consistent. Our reliability is at stake. However, we need to be even more determined and speak with one voice. We did introduce some exceptions and derogations, but they cannot be forever. We should think about secondary sanctions to be imposed on those countries that are not helping with our efforts. The war is on our border. Supporting the aggressor may mean that we are careless about our own security. It is also urgent to use this most powerful weapon, i.e. freezing and confiscating the frozen assets of Russian money abroad. It's not true that it would be illegal. It can be done legally. The Commission is wrong here, both politically and legally. This money should go to Ukraine. Helping the victim is a way to weaken the aggressor.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Bernard Getter.
Mes chers collègues, disons les...
Colleagues, let's state the obvious. No economic sanction against any regime has ever brought an economy to its knees. This is true of Russia today as it was of South Africa. But international sanctions are nevertheless a formidable weapon because they stifle industry, they exacerbate financial difficulties, and they force the target to constantly find ways around them. And this is the case of Putin's Russia. And for this reason, it's absurd, totally absurd, to talk about ineffective blows to Putinism. Putinism is hurt by these sanctions and is suffering because of them, but obviously there are some loopholes in our measures. We need to take new measures that are more targeted and which hurt the aggressor even more. We need to take stock of what has worked well, or worked less well, or not worked whatsoever. And this is what our Parliament will do next month by calling on the Council and the Commission to do even better, even more, and even faster, because the end of this war depends on that. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Lagodinsky, you have the floor.
Effectiveness of sanctions is determined by clarity about our sanctions goals. And effectiveness of sanctions is determined by professionalism of sanctions policies. This Council and this Commission have lost sight of the main priorities. Our priority is to prevent Russian government and Russian machinery from their ability to continue financing this genocidal war. The goal of sanctions is not collective punishment of Putin's opponents in the EU. The interpretation of sanctions by the Commission just recently, according to which Russian dissidents cannot bring to the EU their own personal items, shampoo, soap, those items from Russia, is frankly an embarrassment and self-ridiculing of our sanction instrument, of one of the most important instruments of our foreign policy. Cars with Russian plates should not be allowed in the streets of the EU. Come on, listen to that. Are those our priorities? At the same time, while EU custom officers were hunting down Russian dissidents and their personal cars, we have heard about lifting sanctions from key actors of the media landscape in Russia, based apparently on 2 articles in the media. Is that professionalism that we want in our sanction policies? We hear reports about sanctions lists that are created based on Wikipedia articles. Is that the professionalism that we have? We still do not have a clear understanding of how sanctions are imposed, lifted and implemented. Dear Commissioner, dear Council, we must increase pressure. We must enact more sanctions, and our colleagues were right about that. We must close the loopholes, but please do it with a clear view of helping Ukraine through restricting Russian state, and do this by driving a clear, transparent and professional strategy.
Danke.
Thank you very much. Anna Fotyga is next.
Sie haben das Wort.
President, Minister, Commissioner, 600 days after the outbreak of full-scale invasion by Russia of Ukraine, we still discuss how to curb the power of Russia to perpetrate atrocities, war crimes, genocide. No question, sanctions regime is unprecedented and very important. Yet it is neither sufficient nor consequent. We have to broaden it, and many items possible to take were already indicated. I would add to this diamonds, once more Rosatom, broadening individual sanctions, and I would add also sanctioning countries that allow so much circumvention of sanctions by Russia, and here indicate necessity to broader mini-sanctions imposed in July on Belarus. That is, Lukashenko is an accomplice of Russia, and his regime should be punished as well. Thank you.
Unser nächster Redner ist Herr Dier.
Our next speaker is Mr. Thierry Mariani.
Vous souvenez-vous des premiers mois?
Do you remember the first months following the outbreak of the war in Ukraine? Macron's ministers and members of the European coalition said that we would bring Russia to its knees thanks to sanctions. We would send Russia back to the Stone Age. But in fact, it's inflation which is now making martyrs of our families, not to mention energy costs. So we're preparing another package of sanctions, even though 8,000 people are already subject to them. Even Mr. Borrell had to admit in March that we were coming up to the limits of what we could do. By fanatically sticking to these sanctions everywhere, we're losing out in Asia and Africa and South America. Now, as Mr. Kubilis has pointed out, we're still buying 2 billion euros worth of energy from Russia every month, and like America's our nuclear source, also depends on them. So all we're doing is worrying our few remaining friends.
Thank you. Mick Wallace, please.
A year ago, half the German people thought the EU sanctions hurt Germany more than Russia. This sentiment is going to be stronger now, as Russia's economy overtook Germany's in August. The Russian sanctions triggered persistent inflation across the EU. Higher interest rates, a fall in real wages for workers, a cost of living crisis and a cost of energy crisis. Climate goals were trashed as EU countries fired up coal power stations. Germany's economy entered recession. €742 billion have been spent on energy subsidies, creating unprecedented market fragmentation as richer, more subsidy-capable countries draw investment away from others. The NATO proxy war has seen Europe sacrifice for US interests. European industry has the pleasure of paying multiples more for US LNG than their competitors in the US. The sanctions have backfired and no one in power is admitting it. What's worse, we're about to put the final nail in the coffin as we gear up to cut off China and de-risk because the US told us to do so. In all this, one thing is certainly clear. The EU is the opposite of a meritocracy.
Ich erteile Herrn Milan Ur.
The floor now goes to Milan Urik.
Keď už je tu téma efektívnosti sankcií, tak treba aj...
Thank you very much. If we want to talk about the effectiveness of sanctions, we need to say very clear in Parliament here that the energy sanctions against Russia are not working. They are harming Europe more than Russia. And those who are imposing them are responsible for price hikes and inflation. And another fiasco is the price limit on Russian oil. An agreement was reached for a price cap of $60 for a barrel of Russian oil. Yesterday, there was a $70 price, and these sanctions are supposed to weaken Russia and help Ukraine, but that hasn't happened. Therefore, these sanctions need to be stopped. Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Radislav Sikorski.
Mr. President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the briefing on the state and impact of sanctions. I fully support the financial measures, the measures to stymie the Russian war effort, and measures to tighten up the effectiveness of sanctions. I'd like to focus just on one aspect of them, the personnel sanctions. Patriarch Kirill, in my view, should also be sanctioned. Just because he's a religious figure doesn't give him the right to call for hatred. We sanction various mad mullahs, we should sanction him as well. Then there is Mr. Vasily Nebenzia, the Russian ambassador at the United Nations, who of course enjoys diplomatic immunity in the United States, but not here. I think it's an important message to send to Russian diplomats that justifying a criminal war of aggression and war crimes may not pass. And finally, a real viper, Mr. Sergei Karaganov, who has been advocating the use of nukes against Ukraine and against us. He may not have personally harmed anybody, but Julius Streicher at the Nuremberg trial also didn't harm anybody. We need to send a message here as well. If you behave like a mujik rather than a gentleman, you do not belong in the gentleman's club. Thank you very much.
Danke. Next redner.
Thank you. The next speaker is Kathleen van Bremt.
Mr. President, Mr. Commissioner, as you mentioned, since February 2022, the EU has an unprecedented sanction package in place against Russia. And these sanctions, they mean to change Russia's behavior and end the war by undermining Russia's economy. And although there is effect, of course, but we continue to see that the Russian economy is not hit as hard as we would have expected. Our sanctions are not as effective as we thought they would be. And first of all, and you mentioned them yourself, there's circumvention in place. A lot of products on the sanction list still go to Russia and into the Russian war economy. So we need to step up our diplomatic efforts, but also pressure towards these countries, neighbouring countries, allies that circumvent, but also EU companies that keep exporting these products. But we also need to see how to strengthen the sanctions. When the Russian goods that the EU countries still import represent a value that is multiple times higher than the support we give to Ukraine, you can conclude we need to do more. And that brings me to the diamonds. They are still not included in the sanction list. And I do not understand that we still allow Russian diamonds to be sold in the EU. We need to tackle that as soon as possible.
Danke. Unser nächster Redner.
Thank you. The next speaker is Petras Austrevicius.
Gerbiamas pirmininkė, komisijos nariai, mėly kolegos. Net ir po 11.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, it's been 11 months now. And in spite of all of this, with the sanctions and everything, money has been flowing into Russia. And every euro has been used for destruction. We can see how transport, tanks, everything is carrying on as usual, and those working in the diamond trade continue working with Russian diamonds. So the question is, what do we do? In the first 8 months, exports from Germany to Kyrgyzstan increased by 14-fold. It's absolutely absurd. So what do we do? We've got the question of development and cooperation. We have to put a stop to this, suspend all this type of cooperation with states that will look for loopholes to these sanctions. We need to, however, take action now.
Markéta Gregorova.
Next speaker is Markéta Gregorova.
Brushing off the obvious, tax havens and post-Soviet mafia states, there is a massive elephant in the room, China. Putin and Xi will meet in Beijing today to celebrate many things. Besides the Belt and Road anniversary, they will undoubtedly toast to successful negation of our anti-war sanctions. Total trade between China and Russia hit a new record high in 2022, up to 30%. China might have single-handedly neutralized many of our sanctions by keeping Putin's petro economy afloat and the war in Ukraine going. China replaces suppliers of Western electronic and engineering equipment. Beijing has also helped Russia circumvent the SWIFT sanctions by facilitating more and more trade with yuan. It is evident that while we attempt to slow down and stop Putin's mass murder campaign in Ukraine, China does everything short of direct weapon shipments to help Russia. My question to colleagues from Council and Commission is, you know full well that China's involvement has been discussed in the 11th sanction package, focus on circumvention, and you know full well that your institutions took China out of its scope. How many more pointless sanction packages are you planning to pass then, while the elephant in the room remains unaddressed? Also, maybe you can pass on the message to Hungarian council officials, and they could tell us whether Mr. Orban's and Hungary's position is now pro-Putin, as he's not only blocked another help to Ukraine, but is also the only EU leader present in Beijing today. Thank you.
Mr. Richard Czarnecki, the floor is yours.
Panie Przewodniczący,
Dear President, dear Minister, dear Commissioner, I do think that many of us agree on those sanctions, but I'm a historian by profession, and I'd rather we did talk about the future and the past, because many of our European politicians did prefer to turn a blind eye to the Russian imperialism. So let us think about the past as well. When talking about this 12th package of the sanctions, we should try and close the loopholes which were partly intentionally created previously, because some member states did get derogations and exceptions, and for that they agreed to vote in favor of the sanctions. Belgium and Italy are such examples. I'm trying to be frank here. We should be unambiguous when it comes to the following thing. In the West, we still have companies that collaborate, work together with Russia and earn a lot of money from this. And we are, at least indirectly, tolerating this. So this is a paradox. On the one hand, we are imposing these sanctions on Russia, and rightly so. On the other hand, we do nothing when faced with the fact that our companies, especially from Western Europe, keep earning money, huge money, from the activities in Russia. That should not be allowed.
Okay. Mr. Paolo.
Thank you. Mr. Paolo Borchia has the floor.
Grazie,
Thank you, President. This is a debate in the context of a conflict. People are suffering. So generating disputes are not helpful. Why haven't we learnt from what happened with sanctions in 2014, when the way they were evaded, thanks to oil exports, despite the threshold prices imposed by the European Union and G7, so many people are helping Russia. Trade with China has tripled. Turkey's exports have gone up 90% to Russia. So that's the context. We've seen third country operators buying from Europe and reselling in Russia. In spring of last year, our first package had a tough impact, undoubtedly, but since then the ruble has recovered. Interest rates have gone up. Now, obviously, the European Union's ability to influence on international matters are limited. Let's start thinking about the price being paid by European business for all this.
Mr. Nikolai Willumsen.
Thank you. Mr. Nikolai Willumsen.
EU sanctions on Russia have been effective? No, not as much as they could have been. Special economic interests have protected different sectors from sanctions, from luxury handbags exports to imports of caviar. There's always been a bad excuse. The shipping and banking sectors were protected. Even Russian blood diamonds may only be covered by sanctions from next year. Maybe. Not to speak of how the Turkey's President Erdogan is undermining the sanctions by allowing Russian goods to go through Turkey into EU. And then there are the fossil fuels. Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, EU has paid the Putin regime more than 165 billion euros for fossil fuel imports alone. Money that Putin has used for the war. How many bombs has he bought for those billions? We can do better. Let us strengthen solidarity with Ukraine. Let us strengthen the sanctions.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Ms. Clara Ponsati-Obilius.
Thank you, President. Loopholes in Russian sanctions are yet another byproduct of the EU double standards and lack of spine. Just 3 examples. The illegal issuance of golden visas to Russian investors continues in Spain. Exemptions to Hungary are granted as a response to Orban's blackmail, and sanctions with close ties to Russia have given Azerbaijan the resources for an ethnic cleansing of the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, while the world is not even looking. Double standards may seem a tempting shortcut to further EU interest, but they reveal weakness, decadence, and corruption. Double standards undermine our credibility and influence as international actors. No wonder that Mr. Borrell needs to pathetically beg for recognition from the international community when there is a major crisis. If Europe seeks to lead a rule-based international order and a humane and prosperous way of life, our strength lies in our principles. I hope it's not too late to remember that. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Madame Pilar de la Castillo Vieira.
Muchas gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, despite the import bans on crude oil and derivatives, we know that the European Union is still one of the largest clients for fossil fuels from Russia. The point is that in some member states, first of all, although they're in favour of sanctions, they've actually increased their imports. So much so that over the first half of 2023, LNG exports from Russia to the European Union have been the highest of the last 3 years. The situation requires us to analyse where there are loopholes and omissions that mean the sanctions not being as effective as they should be. First of all, shouldn't we be banning the ban of Russian fossil fuels through European economic waters. We can't have shippers taking these fossil fuels through our waters. We must extend the sanctions to fertilizers. And above all, the European Commission should have centralized, stepped-up oversight to enhance the effectiveness of the sanction regime.
Nicola, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. Despite the horrible atrocities happening now in the Middle East, we cannot and must not turn our attention from ongoing Russian aggression in Ukraine, which entered its 601st day. We need to continue pressuring Russia by all means possible. We should also continue with further measures on Belarus, a Kremlin puppet regime, whom we must also keep accountable. Sanctions are taking place in economically challenging times when our citizens are increasingly anxious, but we have to keep them going as justified response to brutal aggression. Sanctions do work, but the efficiency of sanctions needs to be strengthened, including through a shared approach with our allies. There are still too many loopholes that need to be addressed, particularly regarding fossil fuels, energy imports through third countries and price caps. Finally, I share the view with many others that Russian frozen assets of today can be used to rebuild the Ukraine of tomorrow. Thank you.
Frau Hilde Wautmans, Sie sind am Wort.
So, Hilde Wautmans has the floor.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, this is our 11th sanctions package. Well, it is good that we're adopting sanctions, but 11 packages clearly shows that we haven't been strong enough. Not all the individuals on the Navalny list are on our sanctions list. Russia is still getting around sanctions through third countries, and Russia is still earning billions by exporting oil and gas, even to European countries. The sanctions are working, but, Commissioner, they're not working the way we wanted them to work. The Russian war machine is still working full out, and Putin is still in the saddle. Colleagues, we have to raise our game. We knew which countries are helping Russia get around the sanctions, so let's tackle those countries. The capital of Russian elites is still spread right over Europe. Follow Alexander De Croo's example. Use those assets to build up Ukraine. Colleagues, only if the European Union works together as one strong bloc will we be able to hit Putin. Thank you.
Thank you. The floor goes to Viola von Kramon-Taboudel.
President, Commissioner, colleagues, Putin, the Chinese and their proxies claim that sanctions do not work. Yet, Putin also keeps calling for an end to sanctions. That means that sanctions work and that they hit where it hurts the most, right in Russia's war chest. Need more evidence? The ruble has repeatedly broken the 100-cent mark, while Russia's central bank has once again hiked interest rates to 13%. Even according to Russian data, Russia's GDP shrunk by over 2% in 2022. Instead of the expected 4% growth, this is a 6% loss. In 2021, foreigners invested 40 billion in Russia. A year later, the FDI fell to almost minus 20 billion. The G7 oil cap effectively kept Russian oil well below the market price, thus reducing Russian revenues without creating oil shortage. Russia's budget deficit widened to 30 billion in July. Skilled Russian labor is leaving the sinking ship. Russian assets are still frozen. Colleagues, it is clear that Putin has dragged his country into a bloody, pointless and expensive war. Russia is doomed to fail. Just because sanctions work does not mean that they cannot work even better. We should expose and punish sanctions evasions. Targeting the war enablers must continue. Lowering the oil cap and countering the Russian shadow tanker fleet is the right way to go. The sooner Ukraine wins, the sooner the sanctions will be lifted. Thanks a lot.
Danke. Herr Tertsch, Sie sind.
Thank you. The floor goes to Mr. Touch.
Thank you, President, Commissioner. We all agree very much, I think. There's very broad consensus in this House that we need these sanctions. We must avoid loopholes and workarounds. We must step up the sanctions until Russia yields. And we must provide the resources to the Ukrainians to allow them to recover their territory. There's been a lot of talk about Orban and China as purchasers of Russian goods. But here I'd like to mention the current presidency. The country which has bought the most oil from Russia in August was Spain, after China. %20 goes to China and 80% going directly to Spain. Now, after all this rhetoric, let's get down to brass tacks. Spain, during the course of its presidency office, isn't giving much of an example. There's talk of solidarity with Hamas, and now it's breaking records on oil purchases from Russia.
Next is Gunnar Beck. Thank you, President. EU sanctions against Russia should take effect and be painful. Yes, we're talking about more than just Russia, but the EU is actually continuing to import gas at high prices via Azerbaijan, so it's basically circumventing its own sanctions. And what about Bulgargas, which got 400 million? We're talking about a country that was involved in antitrust cases back in 2018, and they are allowed to deliver Russian gas now by derogation. So keeping mum about all of this, all of these goings on, is not in conformity with our sanctions policy. Now we're talking about prosperity in Europe, and that's the whole reason why we were set up in the first place. So let's take action. Next speaker, Katarina Konečná.
Thank you very much, President. Commissioner, it's been more than a year and a half since the European Union imposed comprehensive sanctions on the Russian Federation following the invasion of Ukraine. Because of these sanctions, Europe is going through an energy crisis. Inflation is rising at record levels. Many households in Europe have seen their living standards fall, and energy companies have been able to enjoy record profits. Energy prices are considerably cheaper than they were last year. It was said that Russia would fall to its knees within a couple of weeks. But things are going through third countries, and Europe is constantly, therefore, acquiring Russian goods. The only people whose lives are made more difficult by the sanctions are civilians. There is no doubt that the sanctions are not an effective solution. The only solution is dialogue for the war in Ukraine. If the EU wants to end the war and doesn't want to just crap the whip on its own citizens, it needs to use its influence to have a peaceful end to the fighting. Colleagues, I think we can all agree that the Russian aggression against Ukraine is unacceptable. However, the sanctions have not brought about the solution. In fact, what we're seeing is Europe is paying a higher price than the aggressor, and the price that Europe is paying sounds the death knell for the economy and our competitiveness, with new dependence, with soaring energy prices, inflation, and disruption to supply chains. The impact assessment was only at EU level, not for individual member states, so the Commission does not want to face facts. The Commission says that the negative impact on Europe is minimal and Russia is lying in ruins. It says that the Russian economy shrunk by 2.1% last year, but it doesn't talk about the fact that this year the Russian economy will increase by 2.2%, while the Eurozone economy is stagnating. Of course, Russia is effective, but it's still doing business, just not with us, and the war has not ended. The aim of the sanctions was to wipe out Russian revenue. Meanwhile, the amount of LNG imported into the EU from Russia has increased by almost 40% over the last 6 months. Several member states are importing more oil. We need to change course immediately. Thank you. It's an own goal.
Andrei Kovacev, Sie haben das Wort gebeten.
Andrei Kovacev, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, colleagues, the sanctions against Russia and the fight against spy networks in Europe are at different levels in different member states. We need to do our best in order to stem the financial inflow into Russia, in order to lessen its capacity to lead this war. There are certain problems with avoiding sanctions thanks to other countries. The aggressor whose bombs have destroyed so many hospitals, schools, and infrastructure has to pay for their reconstruction. That is why we need to find the legal base and use the frozen assets of Russia in order to rebuild Ukraine.
Schaldemose.
Mrs. Schaldemose has the floor.
EU har vedtaget et historisk antal sanktioner imod Rusland.
Thank you. We decided on sanctions against Russia, but the war is still ongoing. Does this mean that the sanctions aren't effective? No, no way. We're seeing destructions, bulldozers going in overnight, destroying houses. This is part of an overall package. You knock, you hammer, you think nothing's going on, but it is important. We're fighting against a threat to our own security, and this hammer, at the end of the day, will finally get through to the foundations, and we will weaken Russia as a result of these sanctions. We haven't got there yet, but let's keep up the pressure. We have to keep up the sanctions, hit harder and harder. We have to believe that it will be effective eventually. That's important for our security, for Ukraine's security. So let's keep up the effort. We have to carry on.
Arvoisa komission edustaja.
Thank you very much, President. Colleagues, Russia does not want to stop the evil with which it threatens the very existence of Ukraine and the West. The EU must remain united in its resistance, and it's each member state's duty. We need to increase pressure on Russia, and we need to weaken Russia's power. The EU must also tighten its stance towards third countries that support Russia's aggression against Ukraine in one way or another. This requires even more effective sanctions. We need to stop sanctions from being circumvented, especially when it comes to blocking routes for oil, gas and technology. We need to really prevent the evasion of sanctions. Russia is clearly using hunger as a weapon to destabilize the entire world food system. The EU, therefore, needs to ensure that grain from Ukraine can reach markets. This is for the sake of Ukraine and the rest of the world. We need assistance with arms as well as economic and political assistance until Ukraine wins.
Saskia Bricmont.
Thank you, Mrs. Saskia Bricmont.
Des sanctions sont efficaces lorsqu'elles sont mises en œuvre. Elles sont alors.
Sanctions are effective when they're new. They're a vital part of Europe's response to Russian aggression. This package is supposed to weaken Putin's regime, but third countries get around it with shameful silence from the European member states. A third of EU member states are still exporting goods to Russia that are directly used to wage war. The sanctions being discussed with the Council now must ensure the sanction regime is effective and avoid anyone evading it in the future. We have to bring an end to the way unscrupulous profiteering has got around the regime. We need to protect the civil populations in countries in conflict. So humanitarian players must be exempted and international law upheld. Thank you.
Monsieur Alexandra Vondra.
Thank you. Alexander Vondra, you have the floor.
We have agreed and we have implemented 11 sets of the sanctions against Russia, and by far it's a big success. I do not remember anything similar in the last decades. However, it still has the loopholes, and we need to fix the loopholes. And one of the largest loopholes is Iran. Iran, which is providing the equipment to Putin, including the drones and other high technology. And Iran, which has also its hidden hand behind what's happened in Israel a week ago. So, ladies and gentlemen, one of the most important things to fill the loophole is to stop Iran. It's to sanction Iran. Please, let's move ahead.
Danke. Herr Jagd.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jak Madison, please.
Suur aitäh. Esiteks sanktsioonide eesmärgist. Sanktsioonide eesmärk.
Thank you very much. What's the aim of the sanctions? From the get-go, it was to stop the Russian war machine, to deprive them of their funds, and we wanted the regular Russian to feel the pain of this war. But what's happened? We buy more LNG than before the war. More than 2 billion euros goes to Russia every month for its oil. And every day we see that we have large trucks going to Russian markets through Eastern European countries. And many political leaders in Europe have had to do with Russian business, such as the Estonian Prime Minister, for example, through her husband. Which is very regrettable. But no war has been won with sanctions before. We feel that if the Russian citizen suffers, they will rise up. But no, the Russian citizen is happy to live in a dump. They will suffer. They will not rise up. So this war can only be won with tanks, with guns. This is the only way to win the war. Thank you.
Kolakusic, the floor is yours.
Sanctions against Russia to stop the war in Ukraine. EU citizens are not interested in the Russian GDP and whether it fell by 1 or 2%. What do the citizens of the EU care about? Was the war stopped by the sanctions? And how does it affect our lives? A year of sanctions have not only failed to stop the war, but we are witnessing a new Russian offensive these days. The living standard of EU citizens in most countries has fallen by 20 to 30%. Any person with at least a little bit of intelligence can see that sanctions cannot stop the war. However, the sanctions are destroying the living standard of EU citizens, first of all. What do we care? Thank you.
Terras.
Mr. Rio Terras, please.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Dear colleagues, from the very outset of Russian aggression against neighboring Ukraine, the EU has posed numerous sanctions on Putin's regime and Russia's economic interests. With 11 packages, we have tried to cut Russia from the markets. We have made an effort to stop trading different types of strategic goods with the aggressor. Sanctions have real influence only if they are followed universally. They are part of the largest strategic effort to force Russia out of Ukraine. Unfortunately, there are still too many loopholes and different ways to circumvent the post-sanctions. It's our task to make sure everyone follows the same line. And I would like to turn to European companies and businesses. Please stop doing business with Russia. It's immoral to do business with aggressor. Thank you very much. Slava Ukraine.
Unser nächster Redner ist
The next speaker is Mr. López Aguilar.
Vielen Dank, President Carras.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carras, Commissioner Reinders, and the Spanish presidency. If only Europe could be as united on migration as it has been in the war by Russia against Ukraine. The packages, there have been various packages of measures. There have been humanitarian ones with the temporary package. We had the energy ones, and also the diplomatic ones within the GH and the Council there. But we've seen 11 sanctions packages in a war lasting more than 2 years. We need to focus on correct implementation to ensure that there is impact with the sanctions, and we shouldn't be buying Russian gas via India or via Kazakhstan. There are 2 pending decisions. Firstly, we need to ensure that the confiscation of Russian assets and goods can be used to fund the reconstruction of Ukraine. And there's also one of the most harmed sectors, such as the port sector and the transport sector as well. We need to focus on that.
Madame Dita Charanzova,
Dita Charanzova.
Mr. President, Mr. Commissioner, Mr. Minister, 11 sanctions packages have been adopted. They have been adopted to punish the Russian regime for their war crimes and to stop the money behind it. But what is the reality? The reality is that trade that helps the regime to fund this war is still going on. You can see it in the images of banned goods still on sale in Moscow and beyond in Russia. It is no secret that countries like China, Kazakhstan or Turkey are being used to bypass the sanctions. The European Union as a whole must step up its efforts in enforcement even further. We must seek a solution at European level. We must equally question our trading agreements with any country that knowingly allows itself to be a transit point for goods going to Russia. Such nations do not merit our good relations. Those that feed this regime should be shamed. Slava Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Ms. Beata Kempa, you have the floor.
Panie Przewodniczący, Panie Komisarzu.
Dear President, dear Commissioner, 600 days of the brutal war of aggression. Putin thought it would all be over in 2 days, but Poland and the whole of Europe and the US have expressed its solidarity with Ukraine. Kiev has been saved. Our economy is in dire straits, but we need to hold on. We cannot do trade with Russia. We need to continue this solidarity. We cannot negotiate with Putin. That regime should be vanquished. The sanctions are effective. The Russian economy is shrinking. We need to close the loopholes, because every week, unfortunately, the Russian airplanes are bringing diamonds to Antwerp. Russian trains are bringing fertilizers to Germany and Belgium. We need to put an end to this, and the European Commission should also look into what German companies are doing in Central Asia. There has been a surprising increase in German exports to those countries. Are the sanctions not being bypassed?
Thank you. Mr. Bernhard Zimniok, you have the floor. Thank you, President. We wanted to bring Russia to its knees via these sanctions so they could not finance the war. But the LNG imports are at record levels, and then oil and gas is being imported via third countries like India. We are paying more and more, and once again, Russia is going to increase its profits. Has this changed the course of the war in Ukraine in a positive manner? No, not at all. The focus on delivery of weapons has actually cost the lives of tens of thousands of Ukrainians and Russians, and the negotiating position of Ukraine has also been weakened significantly. These sanctions have failed. Course correction is overdue, and we need to repair Nord Stream 2 and then boost our economy once again. The only way we can end this will be via negotiations. Thank you. Our next speaker is Francesca Donato.
Thank you, President. The motive of sanctions on Russians was to rein in the Russian government and force it to withdraw from Ukrainian territory. More than a year and a half following the start of the war in Ukraine, Russia is still there and has made considerable progress. The Russian economy is healthier than the European economy, which has suffered from Europe's sanctions against Russia, which produced a serious energy crisis and unprecedented inflationary spiral. The sanctions against Russia have been a complete fiasco. It would be better to recognise there's a political challenge. Continuing with this system is going to entail an ever higher price for our citizens and our businesses. If we don't want Russia to win the war in Ukraine, we must ensure negotiations are into swiftly. There have to be negotiations on a truce which will save thousands of Ukrainians' lives and fend off the risk of total defeat for Ukraine. It's better to lose on a small scale than face complete disaster.
Sandra Cagnette, you have the floor.
President, Commissioner, Minister, colleagues, Russia is planning to increase its military budget for 2024 by nearly 70%. The sanctions are working, but we have to plug the gaps through which Russia is continuing to export energy resources, earning €690 million a day. Unfortunately, the European Union is one of Russia's largest clients for energy resources, adding to Russia's budget to the tune of €2 billion every month. EU and member state political sanctions have to be made more effective so as to reduce Russia's income from energy resources. And we have to cut the ceiling price from $60 to $30 per barrel. We have to stop LNG imports from Russia and stop third countries getting around this by exporting Russian oil to us. Lastly, we must reduce the sales, servicing and insurance of European tankers if they're being used to transport Russian oil.
Merci, Monsieur le Commissaire.
Thank you, Commissioner, colleagues. We're not going to get anywhere like this. The Commission, I know the European Commission has done its best, but the problem is the Member States. The problem is Belgium refuses a diamond embargo. The problem is that France won't go against the nuclear issue. So we have lots of gaps, and it's because of the interests defended by member states of the European Union. We all had hopes that the general interest of Europe, which is to destroy Putin's regime, was going to overcome these particular interests. But no, imports of LNG are beating all records. We haven't taken any real sanctions against those states that are circumventing our sanctions against Putin's regime. So if we carry on like this, we're just going to weaken the impact of our sanctions and allow Putin to carry on with this criminal war of aggression, not just against Ukraine, but against all of Europeans' architecture of security. So we have to take action now. We have to confiscate and freeze Russian assets in Europe now. This is time to take action, be consistent and be effective in the way we deal with Vladimir Putin.
The next speaker is Niels Torvalds.
Arvoisa puhemies, 601 päivää on jo tänään kulunut siitä, kun Venäjä aloitti täysmittaisen hyökkäyksen vuodesta 2014. Pakotteista
we need to have sanctions, but we need to have this in place. If Russia continues to attack and is a threat for our society, we need to continue with these measures. In Finland, geopolitics is an island. These measures have a huge importance for us. Therefore, we need to have proper coordination.
Harald Wilimski, Sie sind am Wort.
Harald Wilimski, you have the floor.
Danke sehr, Herr Präsident. Meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, wären Sanktionen.
Thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we really need to take stock of the situation and, were sanctions an issue? Were they going to ensure price stability? Were they going to take effect? We've been saying, let's start the sanctions now. I've been saying the opposite, and unfortunately I was right. 11 packages of sanctions against Russia have been imposed, and the situation is what we have. Things have got worse. You just take a look at the inflation increase. We have everything, it's linked to the poverty levels in Europe, everything, the business being carried on by the US, circumvention via China and so what by Russia, and the situation overall is, couldn't be more absurd. So we need to work on people coming to the table to find peace. We need to stabilize things so that we can put a stop to all this dying.
Ivan Stefanek.
Mr. Ivan Stefanek, you have the floor.
Dámy a páni, sankcie na ruského agresora.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. European sanctions make sense. Our bilateral trade has fallen below 2%, and imports have fallen from 9.6% to 1.7%, and exports to just under half. And because of the sanctions, people say that their economy has not been affected. So ask them why they're weapons from a country like North Korea. If we want to weaken the aggressor, we should apply these sanctions in a consistent manner and expand them to include diamonds, for example. And it's important to ensure we monitor compliance with these sanctions in order to recognize circumvention at an early stage. We should not allow the money to reach the Kremlin.
And I will give the floor to Sándor Rónai, please.
Thank you very much, Madam President, colleagues. In February 2022, Russia attacked Ukraine, and Putin's aim was to overtake Ukraine within a couple of months. But we can now see that Russia cannot win this war. Therefore, Europe and the rest of the world to stand on Ukraine's side. And thanks to the EU's decisions, we have stopped Russia's army to replace its lost weapons and access modern weapons. Unfortunately, Hungary has serious experience of what Russian occupation looks like. And Viktor Orban is therefore looking to get closer to Putin, and this is unforgivable. We need to maintain Europe's freedom, peace and security. We need to continue this work, and we need to work together to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I will give the floor to Sophia in 't Veld, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Colleagues, I hear the Putin friends from the left and right extremes of this chamber argue against sanctions in great consensus, invoking the economic cost to European citizens. But they should tell the full story. The cost of war is infinitely higher, both materially and morally. And the cynical reality is that despite the sanctions, trade continues. And we see Russians, rich Russians, living, holidaying, conducting their business freely in Europe. The EU law criminalizing the violation of sanctions will help tackle the uneven and weak enforcement by the member states. And yes, more harmonization and strict enforcement are a key priority for Parliament. Of course, that means that some countries will have to change their practices, but the whole point of an EU law is to eliminate backdoors and forum shopping. Making the sanctions work, however, is more important than petty power struggles between national governments and the EU. As a rapporteur, I'm determined to conclude the file by December at the latest, and I count on the cooperation and the flexibility of the Council and the Member States. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our next speaker is Francisco José Milán Mon.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much, Madam President. The Russian economy last year suffered the effects of the sanctions because of negative economic growth. But we could see economic growth of 2.3% by the end of this year. And next year, according to forecasts, the figures will also be positive. The reality is that the Russian economy is not suffering as much as we had hoped. And the High Representative said that these sanctions are a slow-acting poison, but are they actually effective? This is a legitimate question. First of all, does the Commission know if there is stepped-up measures to monitor the compliance with the sanctions and implementation of the sanctions? And secondly, are we trying to reduce our energy? We're trying to reduce our energy dependence, but there are many member states still buying lots of LNG from Russia. And then what about third countries? So these are helping Russia to evade the sanctions. And hopefully then, if we look at these issues, we can see some results. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I will give the floor to Dietmar Köster.
Die Sanktionen haben Russland.
Sanctions perhaps have weakened the economy of Russia, but when we talk about the objectives in order to put a stop to the war, we have failed. We can see stability is still fine in Russia, and sanctions against Russian imports have been circumvented by a number of states. And going back to November last year, we're back to the level we were, although we had initial progress, we've gone back to the initial levels. Such things as microchips or drones being sanctioned, 2/3 of the components in the ammunition on the front use microchips produced by the US. Oligarchs with hundreds of millions of euros in accounts in Switzerland have not had their assets frozen. So how can we, we have to work on these areas if we're going to be more effective with our sanctions. We need negotiations about a truce and to put an end to the atrocities and the war.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues, dear Commissioner. We have reacted against the atrocity of Russia and we have shown solidarity for Ukraine. We have had financial measures, sanctions, bans on importing energy products, and REPowerEU will be, with REPowerEU will be totally independent in the energy sector from Russia. But we need to accept that some of our sanctions have had limited impact and take action now and further strengthen the measures. And we need also new measures in the energy sector. We need to remain firmly dedicated to upholding Ukraine's independence territorially in terms of energy unity. We need to further support the provision of military, financial and humanitarian aid to Ukraine, including the energy equipment that would help to resist and stop the ongoing attacks and aggression. We need to strengthen the alignment of efforts across coalition countries, as well as mechanisms and measures to enhance the transparency of transactions not involving EU shipping service providers, develop additional administrative capacities and restrictions on Russian LNG and LPG. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And our next speaker is Lukasz Kohut. Please.
Bardzo dobrze, że Unia nakłada kolejne
I welcome the fact that we are going to have new sanctions against Russia, closing our ports for Putin's ships, freezing the assets of the Russian oligarchs. Great, but can we make it more painful? Yes, we can, but there is someone who's pressing hard on the brakes, i.e. Viktor Orban, who kept blocking €500 million of EU assistance to Ukraine. He blocked the embargo on oil, and he yields the power of veto. Let us deprive Orban of this possibility to block everything. Article 7 should be triggered. Great news from Poland. We will no longer have Budapest in Warsaw. On the 15th of October, the Polish people have voted. Friends of Putin's friends have lost power. The toxic alliance of Morawiecki and Orban is coming to an end. It's coming to an end thanks to the opposition and the strong civil society. The populists have been defeated. The fifth biggest country in the EU is back. Let us build stronger Europe together.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to Sunčana Glavak.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, manipulation and disinformation is very dangerous, as we have heard here today. The bottom line is that the sanctions were partially effective. However, in spite of the sanctions, Russia is still earning money and financing the war. It's time to open our eyes and say what's really going on. What countries are circumventing the sanctions? The sanctions are a symbol, but also a practical measure trying to stop the aggression on a sovereign state. Like many of my colleagues, I am in favor of seeing what we can do next. It's true that Russian finances have been affected, especially limiting the price of oil against import, but we have to see what more we can do. We have to persist in military and financial aid to Ukraine. And while we are considering the financial implications, we have to be even more decisive, because history will record our solidarity and our will to use all the tools at our disposal to create peace on our territories. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Thijs Reuten. Please.
Thank you, President, dear Commissioner, dear colleagues, Council. Finding unity on sanctions among 27 member states is not easy. In the past 19 months, we managed to adopt 11 unprecedented sanction packages against Russia, an accomplishment, but it's not enough. First, we are too slow. The smaller the steps we take, the more time Putin and his oligarch friends get to adapt. They work their way around bans on tech goods and oil exports. We should be ahead of them in adapting ourselves. Member states have to stop the shameful exchange of interests when negotiating a package at the expense of our effectiveness. If sanctions provide a disproportionate disadvantage to member states, help them. Second, we need to enforce our sanctions. If not, we are creating the loopholes to violate restrictive measures ourselves. And thank you, Commissioner, for your personal commitment to adopt also anti-violation legislation. We cannot have more forum shopping by and impunity for Russian criminals. We have to fix this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to Ludas Mashilis. Please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Commissioner, colleagues. In autumn 2021, we discussed sanctions against Russia while it was amassing 100,000 troops around Ukraine's borders, and we were very brave at that time. We said if it attacks, we will also cut Russia off from the SWIFT system. And I said myself that this was quite a mild request. The braver ones saw Russia's economy ruined. And in the meantime, we've imposed sanctions packages, indeed bans on our own businesses. Russia is arming itself further. So how long will the internal market be open to Russians? We need to have a more courageous scenario.
Yours.
President, Commissioner, sanctions on Russia show us what we can do when we work together. EU money should not fund Putin's illegal war in Ukraine. Europe is a trading superpower, and EU sanctions should show Putin the consequences of breaching international law. The figures lay out the extent of our actions: 11 sanction passages in under 2 years, 1,800 individuals and entities targeted, including Russia's leaders, 21.5 billion of assets frozen, 91.2 billion of Russian import sanctions, including in tech, transportation and luxury goods. Our focus should not only be on more sanctions, but also in ensuring the effectiveness of those we already have. Russia has, of course, sought to disguise its exports by selling them through third countries. Colleagues, we need clear rules and sanctions and consequences of a failure, for example, by large companies, to implement sanctions. And, of course, we should not accept Russian products passed off under the radar of a different country. Russia must continue to pay the highest economic cost for what it is doing in Ukraine. Let's make sure that they do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We come to our Catch the Eye procedure, and the first speaker I'd wish to give the floor is Sean Kelly, please.
I think the important point now, especially from the Commission's point of view, is not to be telling us about the sanctions we've had and how the German economy is retracting, but tell us where and how the sanctions are being avoided. And it's quite obvious that it's widespread. Even member states who have signed up to sanctions are importing Russian products from third countries who are directly importing from Russia. That's not good enough, and that has to be stopped. The same with companies who are not abiding by sanctions. And I think we need a discussion on the sanctions that are there, how they are working, and what the Commission are going to do immediately to ensure that those who are trying to avoid them are going to be stopped. Then we can talk about another package of sanctions. And I think that's the key.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kelly. Our next speaker is Georgios Kyrtsos.
Thank you, President. Sanctions are important and rather effective, but they produce results mainly in the medium and long term. They are not going to solve the problem of Russia's war against Ukraine. Russia is in a position will remain so to finance its aggressive war. First, we created a huge energy dependency. We decreased this dependency, but Russia was able to cover its financial needs in 2022 and 2023. Second, there has been a global shift in favor of major economies like China and India that have increased their collaboration with Russia. Third, the Russian private sector, the oligarchs, was able to react rather effectively to the challenge of sanctions. Sanctions are important and should become more effective, but the only way to move forward decisively is by helping Ukraine to win the war and not just survive the Russian aggression. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll give the floor to Claire Daly, please.
Thank you, President. Those who told us 11 times that sanctions would bring Russia to its knees, they were a necessary gesture of solidarity with Ukraine, part of the toolbox to end the war, are still clinging to the lunacy that maybe the next round will work. We've heard colleagues say, well, sure, look, we know they never fully work. Or, well, we need to add a load of named people to the list. We need to include diamonds. We need to tighten up beyond a WikiLeaks link. We need to blame China. All of it nonsense. The truth is sanctions don't work. Everyone, the US, the countries which contain a majority of the world's population, continue to trade with Russia. Our LNG imports from Russia increased 40% since the war. The Commissioner says the Russian economy is less efficient, it has higher costs, and it's a war economy. I don't know if that's true, but I do know that the European Union economy, which he was very silent about, has certainly got higher costs, is less efficient, and Commissioner Breton tells us it's a war economy. And with the amount of money we're shoveling into arms, it seems like it. The Eurozone is in recession, the cost of living crisis is hitting, ordinary people are paying, while ordinary people in Ukraine pay with their lives. We need peace and diplomacy and an end to this nonsense.
Thank you very much. And I'll give the floor for 1 minute to Kostas Mavridis. Please, Kostas.
Thank you, Madam President. Those of us who seek for the effectiveness of the EU sanctions on Russia, we also agree that the problem is loopholes and practices that circumvent them. Some blame it on China, on Iran, on Kazakhstan, but these are not EU members, neither members of NATO, and certainly they are not our strategic partners. Turkey is in accession process, a NATO member, and some still call it a strategic partner. The figures after the war are astonishing. Turkey's exports to Russia increased by 50%, and Russia's exports to Turkey by almost 200%. While the EU citizens absorb huge costs, rightly so, due to sanctions. And a final point. While all this is going on, Russia and Turkey are still in strategic cooperation to develop the Akku nuclear power plant with significant risks for the EU citizens, especially those in the Mediterranean. So the problem is not just loopholes, it's double standards.
Thank you very much. With this, we close our debate of the speakers, but not, of course, with listening carefully to what Commissioner Didier Reynders will tell us. Please, Commissioner.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, Monsieur le Secrétaire d'État, Mesdames, Messieurs les parlementaires. Je voudrais tout d'abord.
Thank you, Madam President, honourable members. Let me reassure you once again that the sanctions are working. Obviously, they're not our sole means to bring the war to an end, but sanctions are working against Russia just as they worked in other situations. But we must, you're quite right, redouble our efforts. And first of all, I've taken due note of the list of proposals whereby we could extend the various sanction regimes as you propose them. As you'll be aware, in the Commission, we're working together with the Member States to move forward in unanimity in the European Union, both in our dealings with Russia and Belarus, as some of us recalled. It's our daily task to ensure that we can cover the broadest possible range of activities that we want to restrict or prevent on Russia and Belarus's part. And we've done this in the 11 packages up until now on the basis of unanimity. You will have understood that above and beyond defining sanctions, something which is no doubt at least as important is to ensure the effective implementation of those sanctions and to fight any means of evading them. Let's take the example of asset freezes. We've frozen the assets of more than 1,500 individuals and 270 bodies, which means 27 million worth of assets, including of oligarchs, have been frozen, and over 200 billion assets have been frozen across the European Union in terms of assets of the authorities, particularly the reserves of the Russian Central Bank. What we're working on now together with you is finding ways of ensuring we can fight the way the asset freezing regime is being evaded and actually take a step further and confiscate said assets. That's why we need to complete our current work in the trilogue on the proposal to amend the directive on sanctions evasion. This will allow us to open court procedures and not just freeze assets, but confiscate them should anyone seek to evade the sanction regime. Those assets could then be used to help rebuild Ukraine and provide compensation for the damage suffered by a number of victims. So we're continuing to work on the sanctions evasion of any types of sanctions, the imports or exports of goods, as you mentioned. As I pointed out earlier on, we've appointed a special envoy who's in touch with a number of governments and bodies to ensure we can pursue this fight against evasion in conjunction with the Member States and our international partners. I've also taken due note of a number of your comments regarding individual cases, particularly Russian dissidents. Obviously, we've looked into those individual cases, as mentioned, but I must remind you that in the context of all our sanctions regimes, we also need to respect the rule of law. We need to provide proper legal motivation for the decisions we take. That applies in particular to the lists of individuals subject to sanctions whose assets we wish to freeze. Cases have already been referred to the European Court of Justice. Some keep stressing the negative decisions we've had to take on certain occasions. We have also had a number of positive decisions, and I'd like to stress the professionalism of those seeking to get these sanctions regimes working. Asset freezing is a particularly important part of that. But thank you for taking part in this debate, which shows that there's still work to be done in completing our list of sanctions. But above all, there's a day-to-day task to be done to ensure that the sanctions we have are enforced effectively and that we're able effectively to fight any attempts to evade the regime.
Commissioner, and now finally the State Secretary for European Affairs for the Council, Ríos Pascual Navarro, please.
Muchas gracias, Thank you very much, Madam President, Commissioner. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to reiterate the fact that the EU adopted the most ambitious package of sanctions to deal with Russia, and the EU will continue to work on more sanctions if necessary. It's also prepared to maintain this sanctions policy as long as it is necessary. As the Commission has said, sanctions are one tool in the European Union to support Ukraine. But there are also other tools involved in this support for Ukraine. I'd like to highlight that sanctions are designed to prevent Russia from carrying out its war of aggression against Ukraine. They have all been adopted unanimously in the Council. They can cause effects in the European Union, of course. And as several of you have mentioned, we need to work to mitigate some of those effects within the EU. But in any case, the European Union is convinced that the effect is much greater in Russia. When it comes to the possibility of new initiatives, as that the Commission mentioned, the Council will, of course, analyse these closely. So, to conclude, thank you very much for your contributions to this debate. I am sure that if we maintain our unity, we'll be able to exert pressure on Russia in the future by adopting new sanctions where necessary until there is a way for a fair peace to ensure the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. With these words, the debate is closed and the vote will be held at the next part session. This leads us to the next item on the agenda, the Commission statement on the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. And in this regard, I would like to inform the members that there will be